On your quest to find out more about the ancient group known as the Grey Host, you ride through the wilderness of Bankurai, as this was where the last battle involving the group had supposedly taken place. Here you find tents set up and what looks to be an army. So you decide to see if anyone there would know about the Grey Host. On your walking through the camp, you encounter a scholar. When asked if he knows anything about the Grey Host, he says to you,
"Other than the fact that they were defeated here centuries ago, not much, I'm afraid."
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing the Grey Host. More specifically, what exactly did the Grey Host want? To do this, we must firstly go over several things, starting with who even are the Grey Host. After this, we will discuss the history of the Grey Host, so what historical events they have been involved in. Then we will move on to the various allies and enemies the Grey Host has had throughout the eras. Finally, we will discuss the important members of the Grey Host. So let us begin with who the Grey Host are. So the Grey Host are a faction that were originally created by the powerful Nedic vampire King Styrici of Verkarth. However, King Styrici did not have absolute power over the Grey Host, as there were actually the Grey Council that were important in the governing of the Grey Host. So the Grey Council is made up of powerful vampires and lycanthropes. These members of the Grey Council were called exarchs. With these exarchs, we see what Rada al-Saran describes as essentially a sibling-like connection, with him naming them in a note describing them as essentially extensions of his own body. In this note, he would name the 12 he would decide that would be the exarchs in the resurrected Grey Host. These 12 being Ease of the Creeping Dusk, this being the crown, Zinghalis, who Rada saw as the brain, Gazes Red, his right eye, and Seravur Ruliak, his left eye. Braxhard he saw as his tongue. Ulfra Redclaw was his backbone, Kraglan his right hand, and Ulf's Grim Lantern his left hand. Them, the Dirge, represented his breath, Grand Nesby was his sinew, Kaya Avernico Sanctus was Rada's bones, and finally Ritia Longstep was his stride. Now Rada's siblings had been imprisoned in Cold Harbor, leading to him spending centuries focusing on how to save them. However, there was also another mentioned but not named, this being Verandis Ravenwatch, who he wished to destroy rather than include in the exarchs. Rada viewed Verandis as the heart, but only filled with grief and broken beyond repair. Rada only felt hatred towards Verandis. Verandis was the only other so-called exarch to be alive after the battle at Bankurai, escaping the hell that was Cold Harbor, but also disagreeing with the motives, beliefs, and activities of the members of the Grey Host. Now this faction, in both of its forms, was actually a rather large army comprised of lycanthropic beasts, vampires, and other undead creatures. These creatures not only being the foot soldiers, but also being important members of the higher up levels of the group. Much of what the Grey Host has done was not done alone. We know this as the Grey Host had, through their leader, King Styrici, made a deal with the Daedric Prince Molag Bal. Because of this deal, every member of the Grey Host after death would end up in Cold Harbor, instead of whatever afterlife they were destined to end up in, like the lycanthropes who were destined to end up in the realm of Hircine, this being the hunting grounds, leading to those who had died being tortured in the realm of Molag Bal for all eternity. The Grey Host would serve as an army under Molag Bal for eternity as part of the deal, for the power given to King Styrici. Now, the Grey Host have also, throughout various points of history, aligned themselves with other factions. Examples of this being the Icereach Coven, Thorn's Legion, and the Night Hollow Clan. These groups were known to be aligned with what was described as the reborn or resurrected Grey Host. So the Grey Host of the Second Era. This split-off Grey Host no longer being under the leadership of King Styrici, instead being under the leadership of Rada al-Saran. So based on this, what exactly did the Grey Host want? When it comes to what exactly did the Grey Host want, we see that they are not just one faction, instead two. The faction under King Styrici and the faction under Rada al-Saran. Each of these leaders having different motives. Considering that King Styrici had doomed the entirety of the faction to being Molag Bal's army after their deaths, we see his desire for power, this potentially indicating that he wanted his own sort of empire, where the upper class would have been the various lycanthropes and vampiric members of the Grey Host, with those they rule over being the humanoids of Tamriel. Considering the allegiance with Molag Bal, even being part of his army after death would have promised them power when it came to reshaping Nian, which King Styrici desired. allowing Steriki to lead the hordes of Daedra, vampires, lycanthropes, and various creatures making up the armies defending the Dark Anchors. Now, if we move on to the resurrected Grey Host, with part of Rada al-Saran's desires being to free his so-called siblings from their eternity of torture in the realm of Cold Harbor, Rada desires to reform the Grey Host and remove the connection to Morg Bal that has left the faction a ghost of its former self. He also desires to eliminate Verandis, another vampire who he considers to be a traitor to the Grey Host, a vampire that Rada once considered a brother. So Rada, in his leading of the Grey Host, desired both to save those he considered his family, but also revenge. But this is only one part of the story, not the full picture. To learn more, we will have to discuss the history. When it comes to the history of the Grey Host, their story begins at some point in the First Era. This group being founded by a group of vampires and lycanthropes in the ancient city of Urkarth. Now, the Grey Host and the Grey Council as a group would actually exist before the city of Urkarth. The group would start in the caves that run underneath the city, with Urkarth beginning as an undercity civilization and eventually expanding to above ground. Due to Urkarth's origins as a city, many in Hammerfell believed that the city had appeared out of nowhere. Now, with their appearance, they would also manage to conquer all of central Hammerfell. This being after they had originally promised peace with their neighbouring cities. However, they would be taken over with the influence of Urkarth and King Steriki reaching as far as Thorstad Place to the west and Elnir in the east, with those taken over by the city seeing Steriki for what he truly was, a tyrant. Moving on to the year 1029 in the First Era. This is when the Empress Hestra would seek to overthrow King Steriki and the Grey Host. Empress Hestra would arrive on her fiery steed, which was actually a flame Atronach bear known as Fiery Ursula. They would push the Grey Host into western Hammerfell. They would flee west towards the Fallen Wastes. They would burn and kill anything that was in their path, making their way to the southern gate of Bankorai Pass. Here, as they pushed into the garrison attempting to break through, they would slay hundreds of men, draining them of blood, leaving them empty husks of themselves. Now, as this was occurring, this is when Saint Pelin would come in, earning his title of saint. Pelin was a simple beadle at the garrison. During the attack, he would ask his friend Sergeant Clancy what he could do to help. The Sergeant Clancy would tell him to pray for them. Pelin would manage to observe part of the battle from a tower. Here he would observe the horrors that were the Batmen, the wolves, and even more horrifying creatures attacking the garrison. Pelin would head back to the chapel. After praying, he would find people setting up a makeshift hospital. There, a doctor would call for his aid, telling Pelin that they needed his help, not his prayers. Pelin would go over to the doctor. He would observe the soldiers who had come in as pale as sheets. He would question the doctor as to what could cause this in their soldiers, and the doctor would tell him that it was the Batman draining the soldiers of their blood. This would horrify Pelin, who would then tell the doctor that although he knew nothing of fighting or medicine, he would go into battle, knowing that Stendar would guide him. Pelin would run to the top of the Great Gate, which is where he would encounter his friend Sergeant Clancy fighting one of the vampires. Pelin would grab the vampire by the leg so Clancy could kill it with his sword. The sergeant would tell Pelin that the battlefield was no place for Pelin, and that the vampires were at the gates, that they would soon push in and take the garrison. Pelin asked the sergeant if there was anything that could be done, and the sergeant told him that they had hoped to gather reinforcements. However, they would not have enough time. The Grey Host would take over the garrison before the reinforcements arrived. Pelin would announce that he would delay them. Then he would fling himself from the wall and into the battlefield in a horde of vampires. Their wings would break his fall, so he would land alive. He would yell, "Vampires, push not upon the gate, for what you want is here. A strong, healthy body full of warm, fresh blood. Take, drink." The Grey Host would turn as one, drinking the blood of Pelin. Pelin, however, could feel himself collapsing, knowing that the reinforcements that Sergeant Clancy was gathering had not had enough time. So he would pray to Stendar. "O Stendar, God of justice, fill me with an ocean of blood that I might beguile these demons away from the gate but a few minutes more." Pelin would then feel himself filled with blood again, allowing him to continue distracting the Grey Host. Whilst the Grey Host continued to feast, Sergeant Clancy and his reinforcements would push against the weakened wall. These great stones would come crashing down on the Grey Host, killing most of them. The ones who had survived would be taken out by the legions of Empress Hestra's army, which had now caught up, and this would be the supposed end of the Grey Host. Empress Hestra would be so impressed by those at Banchorai that she would honor High Rock with admission into the First Empire. So with this, the bodies of the members of the Grey Host would be taken. Their corpses would be burned in holy fire until all they were mounds of dust. The mountains of ash would be taken south to what would become the unhallowed grave. This would be watched over by the Pyre Watch Guardians. Now this does not tell us what happened to their souls. Well, due to a deal made by King Stiriki with Molag Bal, the souls of the members of the Grey Host would go to Cold Harbor. It did not matter if they were vampire, werewolf, or any other creature. They would all be doomed to torture for an eternity in Cold Harbor. However, with what we know about the Grey Host, not all members would die in this event. Those who survived would scatter. But anyway, moving on to the Second Era, as this is when the Grey Host would re-emerge, their reappearance occurring in the year 582, first being spotted in the year during the events of the Plane Meld. More specifically at the Dark Anchors, as this is where King Stiriki, Fangoril of Cyrodiil, and Zazahad would appear as generals of Molag Bal. They would lead the troops of Daedra, undead, lycanthropes, and vampires at these Dark Anchors. This being the part of the faction that had been taken to Cold Harbor after dying at the battle in Banchorai. However, there were other members who had lived and split off from this part of the faction. We would see them also reappear in this year under the leadership of Rada al-Saran. Their first actions, however, would not be directly by them. Instead, Rada al-Saran would hire thieves to do his dirty work, this being the breaking into the unhallowed grave and stealing the grey reliquaries, these being the urns that held the ashes of the members of the Grey Host. Rada would have the thieves bring these ashes to Skyrim, this being done so he could begin working on resurrecting his fellow members of the Grey Host. Now, in Eastern Skyrim, Rada's alliance with the Icereach Coven would come into play. The Icereach Coven would lure people to the Grinning Hawker in Eastmarch with a promise of generous amounts of gold to be earned for work. The Vestige and their companion Lyris Titanborn would come across these flyers, believing them to be too good to be true and rather suspicious. So they would decide to investigate. As it turns out, there was more than meets the eye going on at the Grinning Hawker Inn. On arriving at the inn, Lyris and the Vestige would find no one inside of the inn. There would be empty bedrolls and even an unfinished meal, but no one inside, no true signs of life. They would, however, find a trail of blood that led to the basement door. Concerned by this, they would follow the trail down the trapdoor into the basement, which would also be seemingly empty. With minimal signs of life, where had all of the people looking for the opportunity gone? Where had this blood trail come from? Well, as it would turn out, in this basement there would be a secret passage where all of the visitors had been taken by their captors. Here, Lyris and the Vestige would find a Nord named Hrolt. Upon talking to him, they would find out that the people running the inn had ordered him and the others wishing to take the job offer into the basement. There was one man who refused, which led to a witch slicing him up rather badly, which is why there was a blood trail leading to the basement trapdoor. Some of the members would fight back against the witches, which would allow Hrolt to slip away, escaping whatever fate awaited those who went with the witches further into the secret tunnels and caves, which would turn out to be the legendary place known as Blackreach. Lyris and the Vestige would continue on deeper into Blackreach, looking for evidence of what was going on. Here, they would find a strange note discussing the Harrow storms that the witches had been summoning. These storms had the ability to transform its victims into what they called Harrow fiends. Eventually, after walking through the cave more, Lyris and the Vestige would find a large cage. In this cage, they would find a Breton man by the name of Emberic, who would tell them that Sister Bolra, the witch who had caused much of this chaos, may be in the Dwarven ruins. Continuing on into the ruins, they would find a Windhelm sentry known as Sentry Darfal, who had agreed to assist Sister Bolra in her plot to assassinate the Skald King. However, like Darfal would betray his own, Sister Balra would betray him when she found him no longer useful. Balra would stab him, attempting to get rid of one little loose end. This would lead to the Vestige and Lyris heading to the Palace of Kings, believing that the Skald King was in danger due to the Icereach Coven's plans. So they would head there, initially being stopped by the Housecarl, who would refuse them entry initially. After convincing the housecarl, they would find Sister Bolera performing a ritual on the Skulled King further in the palace. The Vestige and Lyris would save him, finding out that the Ice Reach Coven had attempted to turn him into a vampiric sleeper agent for the Grey Host. Along with this, as it would turn out that the Coven and the Grey Host would have some ties to the High King Svargrim in solitude. Rada al-Saran had offered the High King Svargrim incredible power, this being in return for his servitude. Because of his hatred of the Skulled King and desire to prove himself superior, King Svargrim would eagerly accept the offer. This would allow for the various allies of the Grey Host to have free reign across western Skyrim, with their camps being found across the area. Here they would use the stolen urns holding the ashes of the Grey Host members from the unhallowed grave to focus their harrow storms. This was done to pull these members of the Grey Host out of Cold Harbor. They would use stone husks to bring these members back to life. With the resurrection of Exarch Singhalis, we would see Rada al-Saran's plan accelerated, getting rid of obstacles that Rada had been facing for centuries since the deaths of the other Grey Host members. Now the plan that was fast approaching was the summoning of a large harrowstorm. This harrowstorm would be large enough to pull all of the souls of the dead Grey Host members out of Cold Harbor and back to Tamriel. However, this plan would unexpectedly be stopped, this being due to the work of several important people, these being Lyris Titanborn, the Vestige, Svanna, the daughter of the High King Svargrim, and Fenorian, a vampire who was a member of Raven Watch. They would expose the High King for the treachery of his actions and kill him. Now this would not be the end of the Grey Host, as Rada would move on into the Reach. Here the Grey Host would slaughter the clans of the Reach that stood in their path, leading them to an old ally, this old friend being Lady Belain. She had previously made a pact with Rada al-Saran centuries before and sought to revitalize her Night Hollow clan with his assistance. So with this arrangement, she would be planted as an advisor to Ard Kadak. She would encourage him to allow the Reach clans to seek refuge in Markarth, making it seem as if they would be safe in the city. However, this would not be true. This was done to gather mortals for sacrifice to fuel the Dark Heart for Lady Belain's and Rada's wishes. They had hoped to bind the Dark Heart to the Grey Host, doing so to pull the rest of the members of the faction out of Cold Harbor and break the contract between the Grey Host and Molag Bal. Now Lady Belain's plan and allegiance with Rada would be discovered by the Vestige and Raven Watch, leading to her fleeing to the Ghostsong clan. Here, Lady Belain would manipulate Nathari, the head of the Ghostsong clan, into enacting the prophecy of the Dark Heart. This prophecy would see the members of the Ghostsong clan enacting a ritual that would lead to the deaths of many of the members of the clan. This being done to awaken the Dark Heart. The Vestige and Arana would manage to stop Nathari, however, not before she had transformed into a Void Mother due to her interacting with the Dark Heart. This would cause the Dark Heart to sleep for now. However, this was not the end of Lady Belain and her work with the Grey Host. House Ravenwatch would go on to discover Lady Belain's Night Hollow Keep, this being found under Blackreach. Deep within the keep, there would be an ongoing ritual in an attempt to reawaken the Dark Heart. By the time the Vestige and their companions would arrive, the Dark Heart would be reawakened. The souls of the sacrificed inhabitants of Markarth would be pulled into the Dark Heart, and in return, the resurrected members of the Night Hollow clan would return from the ashes. Lady Belain would then unseal the doors of Nukan Zel, using this to breach the city of Markarth and attack. These deaths would be used to fuel the Dark Heart further and awaken it more. The Vestige would follow Arana into Nukan Zel. The Vestige and Arana would then gain access to the Orrery of Arkth Zand. Rada had used this to attempt to sever the ties between the Grey Host and Molag Bal. The Vestige and Arana would be taken to the Dark Heart Chamber. Here they would fight Lady Belain. But this fight would take a further interesting turn as Namira would intervene through Arana, allowing Arana to continue the fight, even though her wounds were severe. Arana and the Vestige would defeat Belain. However, Belain is not the only one who would die. With Namira leaving Arana's body, she would die from her injuries. Verandis and the Vestige would manage to stop the Dark Heart from fully reawakening, preventing Rada al-Saran from completing his goal on that day. Rada, however, would manage to escape, this time heading to Greyhaven, an area of the Reach that was surrendered during the plane meld. Stuck in an odd sort of void in between Mundus and Oblivion, Rada planned to use the Dark Heart to anchor the souls of the Grey Host to this sort of sanctuary realm. This would free them from Molag Bal, but it would also make death just a minor inconvenience to them, like it is to the Daedra, which could allow the Grey Host to essentially be undefeatable, able to go on never-ending conquests. To do this, Rada al-Saran would attempt to summon an apocalyptic storm within Greyhaven, this storm known as the Dark Storm. This being done with the desire of consuming all of the souls in the Reach to fully power the Dark Heart. However, this would be stopped by Verandis, the Vestige, and Lyris Titanborn. They would manage to slay Rada before he could unleash the Dark Storm, saving the souls of all who lived in the Reach. So based on their history, what exactly did the Grey Host want? Well, this again has to be split into two parts, essentially the Grey Host of the First Era and the resurrected Grey Host of the Second Era. In the First Era, the Grey Host desired to lay claim to their own parts of Tamriel, expanding their small empire in central Hammerfell. We also notice that, with Rada's comments in the memories of Verandis, the Grey Host do not desire to align themselves with any human empire, specifically Hestra's, as they believe that the Grey Host is more powerful than the humans. This they would eventually find to be wrong. So with the original Grey Host, they desired power and considered themselves to be superior to those who were not part of the faction. This group desired their own place in Tamriel, where they did not have to hide their condition for fear of being hunted. Instead, they desired to be the group who were in charge and feared. Now with the Grey Host of the Second Era under Rada al-Saran, they desired several things. Firstly, Rada al-Saran desired freedom from Molag Bal for his fellow members of the Grey Host. He desired to remove the bonds of servitude to the Daedric Prince completely and cut their ties to Cold Harbor. We see this with the various attempts at reviving the members of the Grey Host, both the Exarchs and the General Soldiers. We also see this in his attempt to bind the Grey Host to Greyhaven. This is also where Rada's plan begins to have similarities with King Styraces in the First Era. This being due to the fact that if Rada had been successful in the binding of the souls of the Grey Host members, they would essentially not really die. They would just respawn in Greyhaven instead of dying. This would allow them to conquer the whole of Tamriel if they so desired. But this is only one piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. To learn more, we will need to discuss the allies and enemies of the Grey Host. When it comes to the allies and enemies of the Grey Host clan, there have been several throughout the eras that have been important, with some even beginning as friends and becoming foes over time. So to discuss this, we should firstly discuss the allies of the Grey Host. The first of these being the Ice Reach Coven. The Ice Reach Coven are a clan of witches that were native to the Reach. Now, the Ice Reach Coven were an important ally to the Grey Host in the Second Era, this being due to their assistance in Rada al-Saran's plans. One of their main duties being the mastery of the Harrow Storm ritual. Now, a Harrow Storm is a combination of magic from the Ice Reach Coven and vampiric alchemy. These storms leave a path of death and destruction behind. It also had the power to turn people into near mindless shells known as the Harrowed, with others becoming feral vampires known as Harrow Fiends. Now, the Ice Reach Coven had reasons to align with the Grey Host, as this would be mutually beneficial for both parties. The Ice Reach Coven desired to remove the Nords from the Reach, and they saw working with the Grey Host as an opportunity to regain the Reach. As we know, this is not the only alliance that the Grey Host had. We also see them working with the Night Hollow clan. Now, the Night Hollow clan were one of the first vampire clans to emerge, potentially dating as far back as the Merethic era. This clan was rather different to other vampires due to their reliance on the Dark Heart. Now, because of their reliance on the Dark Heart, the Night Hollow vampires would lose their ability to feed on blood, only being able to feed on the energy from the Dark Heart. But over time, the power of the Dark Heart would wane, and this would lead to them rationing the power, with only those who were considered to be higher up allowed to feed off of its energy. This would lead to those who were considered lower in the clan starving and dying, eventually leading to most of the clan dying off, except for Lady Belaine, who would make a deal with Rada al-Saran centuries ago. This being done in hopes of reviving her clan, as they both desired the Dark Heart revived at its full power. Now, if we look at the earlier days of the Grey Host, in the First Era, they would also have alliances with two beings who would become future enemies. The first of these being Molag Bal. In the First Era, King Styraces would make a deal with Molag Bal, which would supposedly give him immense power. Harbor. However, it would lead to him and the souls of all other members of the Grey Host being doomed to Cold Harbor after death. Several members of the Grey Host would also be forced to fight for Molag Bal during the Plane Meld, which is why he is considered to be an enemy in the Second Era. Rada al-Saran feels as though his siblings suffer in Cold Harbor. He would even tell the Vestige off for killing Zinghalis and Ulfra, his brother and sister. By killing them, the Vestige had sent them back to the hated Molag Bal. And considering that Rada spent much of his life figuring out how to sever the bonds between the Grey Host and Molag Bal, it is evident that this alliance was no longer desired by Rada. Now, if we move on to Varandas Ravenwatch, this is another ally turned enemy that we see in the relationships with the Grey Host. So at some point in the First Era, Varandas was actually a member of the Grey Host. However, he had very different beliefs to the Grey Host. He would try to convince the Grey Host to abandon their predatory instincts and instead only feed on those who were willing. Varandas, during his time with the Grey Host, would attempt to convince the Grey Host to see mortals as their equal. Now, during his time with the Grey Host, Varandas would actually be a vital member. He would spend his time experimenting, attempting to figure out a way to pull the souls of vampires out of Cold Harbor and mortals out of their own afterlife. His goal was to end death, so all creatures could coexist forever peacefully. However, Varandas would pull the plug on his experimentation due to him considering his own research to be too dangerous. He would later leave the Grey Host with the disagreement in ideals, this leading him to be perceived as an enemy by Rada al-Saran, as he abandoned the Grey Host in Rada's eyes. Now we should also move on to someone who was an enemy of the Grey Host in the First Era, this being Empress Hestra and the First Empire, also known as the Alessian Empire. Considering that Rada al-Saran believed that Empress Hestra and her armies would easily be crushed by the Grey Host, he saw them as no threat in the First Era, whilst King Stiriki desperately craved war, according to Varandas' journal. Because of the threat that the Grey Host posed to the people of Tamriel, we would see Empress Hestra and her legions attack Verkar, making them more than just an ignorable empire that will rise and fall like the rest of the mortal kingdoms before them. So based on their allies and enemies, what exactly did the Grey Host want? In the First Era, the Grey Host under King Stiriki desired power, land, and greatness. They desired control over the people in their kingdom and to expand their kingdom. In the Second Era, we see these desires change. We see the new leader of the Grey Host, Rada al-Saran, desiring to fulfill a promise to free the members of the Grey Host that were currently in Cold Harbor due to the deals made by King Stiriki in the First Era. Because of this, we see several alliances made with various covens and clans. These alliances being strategic in the sense that it would assist Rada al-Saran in freeing the members of the Grey Host from Cold Harbor. Rada would use these groups like the Iceroot Coven as a way of achieving this goal, being previously noted as viewing mortals as lesser beings. Now, although Rada al-Saran was no longer aligned with Varandas, in fact he despised him and desired to kill him, he did see his worth, the worth in his work he left behind. This work left behind would allow Rada to achieve the goal of reviving his Grey Host siblings, pulling them out of Cold Harbor and the clutches of Molag Bal. So Rada al-Saran desired to return his fallen brethren to Tamriel and ensure that they would never face the hell that was Cold Harbor again, allowing them to rule over mortals and expand their once great kingdom after the dust of the Three Banners War settled, if there would even be much left. But this is only one part of the story, not the full picture. To learn more, we should discuss the important members of the Grey Host. When it comes to the important members of the Grey Host, there have been several throughout the eras. The first of these being King Stiriki, who is also known as the Vampire of Verkarth. He was an Edic man who became a vampire at some point in his life. However, there is no mention as to who turned him. We do know that after he was a vampire, he would make a deal with Molag Bal, which would give him much of his power. Now, he was the leader of both Verkarth, which was a city in central Hammerfell, and the Grey Host, which happened to be a massive army of vampires, lycanthropic creatures, and the undead at the time of his reign. Considering that he was described as wanting war by Varandas, and was willing to make deals with Molag Bal to gain power, he was considered a rather power-hungry person, or vampire. Now, if we look at Rada al-Saran, who we know to be another important member of the Grey Host, But like all vampires, he did not begin his life as one. Rada al-Saran would actually start his life over in Yakuta, becoming a Yakutan warrior. Because of this, he would migrate as part of the soldiers claiming Hammerfell. This is how he ended up in Tamriel. Now, being a soldier dedicated to perfection in his craft, this would be his downfall. Rada would duel Lecky, and this duel would end in a draw. Rada would view this as a failure and would lose the ability to summon his Shihai, his spirit sword. This would lead to him falling into the clutches of Molag Bal, who would turn him into a vampire. After this, Rada would eventually find the Grey Host and join them, becoming an important member of the Grey Council. But with the deaths of the majority of the Grey Host at the hands of the First Empire, Rada al-Saran would obviously spend centuries looking for a way to save his friends from Cold Harbor. Now, these are the two main players of the Grey Host, with little being known about the other exarchs that make up the faction. So based on the important characters, what exactly did the Grey Host want? Well, King Steriki seemingly cared most about acquiring power. We do know that he did share the power with the exarchs in the Grey Council. However, considering that he sold the members out to Molag Bal, it is unlikely that he cared about those in the faction. Whereas if we look at Rada al-Saran and his path to the Grey Host, he is rather different. He begins as a powerful warrior who had lost it all due to the obsession with perfectionism. He lost his ability to summon his spirit sword. He lost his honor and his sense of belonging. This making him vulnerable to Molag Bal, which would lead to him becoming a vampire. With this, we would see him finding his honor and his sense of belonging in the Grey Host. However, this once again being lost with the deaths of those who he believed to be his siblings. So Rada did not truly desire power, but belonging. So based on who the Grey Host are, their history, their allies and enemies, along with their important members, we can finally answer the question: what exactly did the Grey Host want? The Grey Host of the First Era under the leadership of King Steriki desired power. They viewed humans and other mortals as lesser, so they did not desire to align with them or work with them. They were a powerful faction aligned with Molag Bal, a Daedric prince who promised them even more power in his deal with King Steriki, which would lead to them losing their freedom in their afterlives, their souls only going to Cold Harbor, not their previous destination, like how the werewolves should have gone to Hyacinth's hunting grounds. Considering that the Grey Host in the First Era built the city of Verkarth and established their own kingdom of sorts, they desired a place where they could live without the threat of vampire or lycanthrope hunters. Now, considering the experiments their former ally Verandus had done during the First Era before the Grey Host was essentially destroyed by Empress Hestra, it seemed as if they desired to free the deceased members from Cold Harbor, as Verandus had been attempting to bring people back from the dead with this intent. With this, the Grey Host from the Second Era would build upon these experiments, as Rada al-Saran would desire to bring back those he saw as his siblings, being willing to work with mortals and others outside of the Grey Host to achieve this goal. Considering that Rada sought to belong after his perceived loss to Lecky, he desired to bring them back to save them, and he desired to never lose them again. With this, he wanted to create a way for them to never truly die again. If he was successful, he would never lose his family. They would be able to rebuild and create a kingdom for vampires better than their old home. So King Steriki desired power in his leadership of the Grey Host. He desired for the Grey Host to be the most powerful thing that had ever been. And Rada al-Saran desired the Grey Host to never die in the way they had under King Steriki. So let me know in the comments who you think the best leader of the Grey Host was, and what they truly desired. A special thank you to all of our Lore Archaeologist supporters. You guys help keep this channel running. And thank you to anyone who is joining our memberships. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one. It is about the Daedric Prince Nimira and why anyone would choose to worship them.